She lived alone in the countryside. An Australian Outback Tale, 1910. The red earth stretched endlessly beneath a merciless sun, its ancient face cracked like the weathered hands of time itself. In this vast expanse of the Australian Outback, where the horizon shimmered with heat mirages and the silence could drive a soul to madness, stood a weathered homestead, a testament to human determination against nature's indifference. Here, where the nearest neighbour lived 30 miles away and the mail came once every 3 months, Margaret Ashford had carved out an existence that most would call impossible. At 42, her auburn hair now streaked with premature silver, she had learned to find companionship in the cry of the wedge-tailed eagle and the whisper of wind through the ghost gums. But on this particular morning in March 1910, as the sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, Margaret would discover that destiny sometimes arrives at your doorstep in the most unexpected form, broken, bleeding, and barely breathing. The sound of hoofbeats, irregular and laboured, cut through the morning stillness like a prayer answered by a God who had seemed deaf to her pleas for so long. Margaret set down her tin cup of billy tea and stepped onto the weathered veranda, her bare feet silent on the sun-bleached boards. What she saw would change everything. And if you find yourself drawn to stories of resilience and unexpected connections in Australia's untamed heart, consider joining our journey by subscribing, because every tale of survival deserves witnesses who understand that the most profound transformations often happen in the loneliest places.
Chapter 1. The Stranger's Arrival. Margaret's calloused hands shielded her eyes as she watched the figure approach. The horse, a bay gelding with its ribs showing through a dull coat, stumbled rather than walk, its rider swaying like a ship's mast in a storm. Even from a distance, she could see the dark stains on the man's shirt, the way his head lolled forward as if sleep and death were fighting for his soul. She had lived alone for 7 years now, ever since William's heart had given out during the drought of 1903. 7 years of talking to herself, of celebrating birthdays with only the stars as companion, of lying awake at night listening to the dingo calls and wondering if this was all there was, if this endless cycle of sunrise, chores, sunset, and solitude was to be her entire legacy. The stranger's horse gave a final shuddering whinny before its legs buckled. Both animal and rider collapsed in a cloud of red dust not 20 yards from her front steps. Margaret didn't hesitate. Loneliness had taught her many things, but it had never taught her to turn away from suffering. She ran towards them, her worn boots kicking up small clouds of dirt, her heart hammering with an emotion she couldn't name. Was it fear, hope, or simply the shock of human contact after so many months of silence? The man was unconscious, his breathing shallow and rapid. Blood had dried in dark patches across his blue work shirt, and his lips were cracked white from dehydration. But it was his hands that caught her attention, hands that spoke of hard work and harder choices, scarred and strong despite their current stillness. "Easy now," she murmured, though she wasn't sure if she was speaking to the man or to herself. "You're safe now. You're not alone anymore." The irony wasn't lost on her. She who had been alone for so long, she sometimes forgot the sound of her own voice, telling this stranger he wasn't alone. But as she knelt beside him in the dust, checking his pulse with fingers that hadn't touched another human being in 8 months, Margaret felt something she almost forgotten existed. Purpose. The horse, she could see, was in bad shape but salvageable. The man was another story entirely. She would need to get him inside, clean his wounds, and pray that whatever had driven him to her door hadn't followed him. In country this remote, trouble usually wore many faces: drought, bushfires, claim jumpers, or worse. But as she slipped her arms under his shoulders and began the difficult task of dragging him towards the house, she found herself whispering words she hadn't spoken in years.
Thank you. Whether she was thanking God, fate, or the stranger himself, she couldn't say. All she knew was that the crushing weight of solitude that had pressed down on her chest every morning for 7 years had suddenly lifted. For the first time since William's passing, she had a reason to hope that tomorrow might be different from today. The man stirred, she half carrying, half dragging him up the veranda steps, mumbling something that sounded like water or perhaps daughter. His eyes fluttered open for just a moment, pale blue like the winter sky over the ranges, before consciousness slipped away from him again. "Hold on," Margaret whispered, surprised by the fierce protectiveness in her own voice. "Just hold on." She had no idea that this broken stranger would become her salvation, just as she would become his. She couldn't foresee the way his gentle stories would fill her empty evenings, or how his grateful smile would teach her to see beauty in her harsh world again. She didn't know that love could bloom in the most unlikely soil, or that two damaged souls could create something whole and beautiful together. All she knew was that loneliness had loosened its grip on her heart, and she was determined not to let it tighten again. Sometimes our greatest blessings arrive disguised as burdens, don't they? In the unforgiving landscape of the human heart, unexpected connections can flourish against all odds. If stories like Margaret's resonate with your own journey of resilience, we'd love to have you join our community of fellow travellers. Subscribe to follow more tales from Australia's remarkable past. Hit that like button if this chapter touched something in your soul, and share in the comments below. What unexpected blessing has arrived at your own doorstep when you needed it most? Your stories help us bring more of these forgotten voices to life.
Chapter 2. The Healing. For 3 days, Margaret lived in a world divided between hope and fear. The stranger, who had mumbled his name was Thomas during one of his fevered moments, drifted in and out of consciousness like a boat caught between tides. She had cleaned his wounds as best she could with carbolic acid and hot water, discovering that most of his injuries came not from violence, but from exhaustion and exposure to the elements. His body told the story of a man who had pushed himself beyond all reasonable limits. During the daylight hours, she found herself moving with a purpose she had forgotten existed. The morning chores that had once stretched endlessly now seemed almost insufficient to fill her time. She would check on Thomas every hour, placing a cool cloth on his fevered brow, spooning drops of water between his cracked lips, and talking to him in low, steady tones about anything that came to mind. The weather, the condition of his horse, which she had named Hope, the small dramas of her chickens, and the one milk cow that had somehow survived the last drought. "You're a drover, aren't you?" she said on the second evening, sitting beside the makeshift bed she had created in her front room. The oil lamp cast gentle shadows across his face, and for the first time she could see past the weathering and exhaustion to the man beneath. He was perhaps 35,
with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar and strong features that spoke of both kindness and determination. Your hands tell the story. Rope burns here and calluses mare from handling cattle. And Hope out there, she's a stock horse if I ever saw one. Thomas stirred at the sound of her voice, his eyes fluttering open. For a moment, he seemed confused, his gaze darting around the unfamiliar room before settling on her face. "You're the angel," he whispered, his voice rough as sandpaper. I felt heat rise in my cheeks. "No angel, I'm afraid, just Margaret Ashford. And this is my homestead. You collapsed at my door 3 days ago." He tried to sit up, but I placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Easy now. You've been through an ordeal." "My horse," he said. "She's fine, fed and watered and resting in my paddock." "What happened to you out there, Thomas?" The use of his name seemed to anchor him, and she watched as memory returned to his eyes like water filling a dry creek bed. The mob scattered during a storm near Alice Springs. Spent 2 weeks trying to round them up with just me and Hope. By the time I gave up, he closed his eyes. Shame clouded his features. Lost 300 head that belonged to the McPherson station. They'll never trust me with another drove. I'd heard enough stories from William's droving days to understand the weight of such a loss. A drover's reputation was everything in this country, and losing a mob was career-ending disgrace. But looking at this man, at the way he had nearly killed himself trying to recover those cattle, I saw something that had nothing to do with failure. "You didn't give up because you were weak," she said quietly. "You gave up because you were smart enough to choose life over pride."
Thomas looked at her with such surprise that Margaret realized he had been expecting judgment, condemnation, perhaps even rejection. Instead, she found herself leaning forward, her voice taking on a passionate intensity she hadn't heard from herself in years. "Do you know what I see when I look at you? I see a man who pushed himself to the very edge of what's humanly possible because he gave his word. I see someone who values honor more than comfort, who tried to do right even when the world seemed determined to break him. You don't understand. I understand plenty." The words came from a place she hadn't accessed in 7 years, from the part of herself that had once believed in possibilities rather than just survival. Thomas studied her face in the lamplight, and Margaret felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with physical vulnerability and everything to do with the walls around her heart suddenly becoming transparent. "What did you fail at?" he asked softly. "Being enough," she whispered, the confession slipping out before she could stop it. "Being enough to make my husband want to stay when the drought got bad. Being enough to keep him from working himself to death trying to prove we could make it here. Being enough to make a life that felt like more than just existing." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. Instead, it felt like the moment when two people recognize something in each other, some shared understanding that goes deeper than words. "How long have you been alone here?" Thomas asked. 7 years. 7 years of talking to myself and pretending it was enough. 7 years of watching sunsets without anyone to share them with, of celebrating Christmas with just me and the animals, of lying awake at night wondering if this is all there is. Thomas struggled to sit up, and this time she didn't stop him. He reached for her hand, his fingers warm and calloused against her palm. "You saved my life," he said simply. "But I think maybe
maybe we saved each other. Margaret looked down at their joined hands and felt something she had thought was lost forever. The possibility that tomorrow might hold something beautiful instead of just another day to be endured. Outside, the night sounds of the outback continued their ancient symphony, but inside the little homestead, two broken people had begun the delicate process of becoming whole. Healing, they say, rarely happens in isolation. Sometimes the medicine we need most comes not from bottles or powders, but from the simple recognition that we are not alone in our struggles. Margaret and Thomas are discovering that connection itself can be a form of salvation. If you're finding hope in their journey, please subscribe to join us for the chapters ahead, and let us know with a like if this story of unexpected companionship speaks to your heart. In the comments, we'd love to hear about the connections that have helped heal your own spirit, because every story of human resilience deserves to be shared and celebrated.
Chapter 3. The Blossoming. As Thomas grew stronger, the rhythms of the homestead began to change in ways both subtle and profound. What had once been Margaret's solitary domain became a place of shared purpose, where two people moved around each other with the careful consideration of those learning to live in harmony. By the end of his first week, Thomas was well enough to insist on helping with the daily chores, despite Margaret's protests that he should rest. She found him one morning in the chicken coop, speaking softly to her Rhode Island Reds as he gathered eggs with the gentle precision of someone who understood that everything, no matter how small, deserved respect. "You don't have to," she began. But he looked up at her with such genuine contentment that the words died on her lips. "I've been taking care of myself since I was 14, he said, placing the last egg carefully in the basket. "But I've never had the chance to take care of someone else. Not properly. It feels right." Margaret watched him move through her world with increasing confidence, noting how he never presumed to change anything without asking, never took over tasks that were clearly hers, but simply made himself useful in ways that complemented rather than competed with her established routines. When she mentioned that the windmill had been squeaking for months, he spent an afternoon oiling the bearings. When he noticed her struggling with a section of fence that had been damaged by wallabies, he quietly repaired it while she was tending to her vegetable garden. But it was in the evenings that their connection truly deepened. After the day's work was done and they sat on the veranda watching the sun paint the sky in impossible colors, Thomas would tell her stories from his years on the droving trails. Not just the adventures and mishaps, but the quiet moments. The way dawn looked different in every part of the continent. The particular sound cattle made when they were content. The characters he met in dusty towns whose names weren't on any map. There was this old Aboriginal man near Tennant Creek, must have been 70 if he was a day, but he could read the land like a book written in his own language. He taught me to find water by watching the way certain birds flew, showed me which plants could keep a man alive when there was nothing else. Margaret leaned forward in her chair, captured by the reverence in his voice. "What was his name?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she was ready for the answer. "Called himself Charlie, though I suspect that wasn't his real name. Real names are sacred things," he said, "not to be shared lightly." Thomas paused, his gaze distant. He said something I've never forgotten, said that every person carries two spirits, the one that fears being alone and the one that fears being truly known. Most folks spend their whole lives trying to balance those two fears. And which do you fear more? Margaret asked, though she wasn't sure she was ready for the answer.
Thomas turned to look at her, and in the fading light, his eyes seemed to hold depths she was only beginning to explore. Used to be the second one. Spent years keeping people at arm's length because it seemed safer. But being here with you, he trailed off, shaking his head. I'm starting to think maybe the real fear isn't being known. Maybe it's knowing yourself enough to believe you're worth knowing. Margaret felt her breath catch. In 7 years of solitude, she had become an expert at avoiding that very question. Was she worth knowing? Had she retreated to this remote homestead because she loved the isolation, or because she was terrified of discovering that connection with another human being might reveal her to be somehow insufficient? I used to dream about having conversations like this, real conversations about things that matter. William was a good man, but he wasn't much for talking about feelings or philosophy. I thought maybe that part of me, the part that wondered about deep things, had just withered away from lack of use. It didn't wither, Thomas said gently. It was just waiting. As the weeks passed, their conversations ranged across territory neither had explored with another soul. They talked about the books Margaret had read during her lonely years, volumes of poetry and philosophy that William had tolerated but never shared. Thomas revealed that he carried a small leather journal in which he recorded not just the practical details of his travels, but observations about the country and its people that showed a mind far more thoughtful than his rough exterior suggested. I write things down because I'm afraid I'll forget, he confessed one afternoon as they worked together to repair the garden fence. Margaret paused in her work, looking at this man that had arrived at her door broken and desperate and was revealing himself to be someone of unexpected depth and sensitivity. Would you mind if I read some of what you've written? The vulnerability in her voice matched the vulnerability in his eyes as he considered her request. Only if you let me read some of your books, the ones with your marks in the margins. I've noticed you argue with the authors sometimes. They spent that evening sitting close together on the small sofa in Margaret's front room, sharing the intimate experience of seeing the world through each other's eyes. Margaret read passages from Thomas's journal that revealed a poet's soul hidden beneath a drover's weathered exterior, while Thomas discovered in her marginal notes a mind that grappled with questions of meaning and purpose with the intensity of a philosopher. Listen to this, Margaret said, her finger tracing a passage in Thomas's careful handwriting. Today, watched a mobberoos moving across the salt pan at sunset. Something about the way they moved, not hurried, not lazy, just perfectly in tune with the rhythm of the land itself, made me think that maybe we spend too much time trying to impose our timing on the world instead of learning to move with its natural patterns. She looked up at him with wonder. Thomas, this is beautiful. You see things most people miss entirely. If this story touched your heart, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next Outback tale.
He ducked his head, embarrassed by the praise. Just thoughts, nothing important. Everything you think is important, Margaret said with such fierce conviction that Thomas felt something shift in his chest, like a door he hadn't known existed suddenly swinging open. Later that night, as they said goodnight at the doorway to the small room where Thomas slept, Margaret found herself hesitating. The space between them seemed charged with possibilities neither was quite ready to name. "Margaret," Thomas said softly,
I need you to know something. I came here by accident, but I'm staying by choice, if you'll have me." She reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "I stopped believing in accidents the day you arrived," she whispered. "And yes, I'll have you, for as long as you'll stay." Outside, the Southern Cross wheeled overhead in its ancient pattern, but inside the little homestead, two souls who had thought themselves broken beyond repair were discovering that love doesn't always arrive with fanfare and promises. Sometimes it grows quietly in the space between sunrise and sunset, in shared work and honest conversation, in the simple recognition that some connections transcend explanation and exist beyond the reach of fear. In the vast expanse of the human heart, love often grows not in moments of grand gesture, but in the quiet spaces between words, in the comfort of shared silence, in the recognition that two imperfect souls can create something beautiful together. Margaret and Thomas are discovering that healing and love are often the same process, just viewed from different angles.
The seasons turned as they always had in the outback. But for the first time in 7 years, Margaret found herself looking forward to each change rather than simply enduring it. Spring brought wildflowers that carpeted the red earth in unexpected splashes of colour, and she and Thomas would walk among them in the early mornings, their hands naturally finding each other as they planned improvements to the homestead and shared dreams they had thought buried forever. It was during one of these walks, 6 months after Thomas's arrival, that Margaret made a discovery that would test everything they had built together. Near the old creek bed where she sometimes went to think, she found evidence of recent campfires and horse tracks, signs that someone had been watching the homestead from a distance. "Thomas," she called, her voice tight with concern. "You need to see this." He studied the tracks with the experienced eye of a man who had spent years reading stories written in dust and stone. His face grew grim as he recognized the distinctive pattern of iron horseshoes that had been modified with small notches, a mark used by the Kellerman brothers, a pair of claim jumpers who had been terrorizing remote homesteads from Alice Springs to Broken Hill. "They've been watching us," Thomas said quietly, "probably trying to figure out if we're worth the trouble." Margaret felt the old fear creep back into her chest. Not the fear of being alone, but the fear of losing what she had found. What do they want? Property like this, established and remote, it's perfect for their operation. They drive settlers off, forge new deeds and sell to the next hopeful family coming out from the cities. Thomas's jaw tightened. "I've heard about them from other drovers. They usually start with intimidation, move to property damage, and if that doesn't work..." He didn't need to finish. They both understood the stakes. That evening, as they reinforced the doors and windows of the homestead, Margaret found herself studying Thomas's face in the lamplight. The soft, contemplative man who had shared poetry and philosophy with her was still there, but underneath she could see the steel that had kept him alive through years of droving in dangerous country. "You could leave," she said quietly. "This isn't your fight. You didn't sign up for this when you decided to stay." Thomas stopped his work on the window latch and turned to face her fully. "Margaret Ashford," he said, his voice carrying a quiet intensity that made her breath catch. "Do you really think there's anything in this world that could make me walk away from you now?" She searched his eyes and found not just determination, but something deeper, a commitment that went beyond the romantic, beyond the practical, to something that felt as fundamental as the bedrock beneath the red earth itself. I love this place, Thomas continued, his hands gentle on her shoulders, but I love you more, and I'll be damned if I let anyone take away what we've built here. The Kellerman brothers came 3 nights later, just before dawn, when the world was caught between darkness and light. Margaret and Thomas were ready for...
The confrontation, when it came, was not the violence they'd braced for, but something more complex. The elder Kellerman brothers, a weathered man with calculating eyes, had clearly expected to find a frightened woman alone, or perhaps with a hired hand who could be bought off. Instead, they found 2 people who faced him with the quiet confidence of those who'd already survived their worst fears. "This is prime grazing land," Kellerman said, his voice carrying the false reasonableness of a man used to getting his way through intimidation. "Shame to see it going to waste with just the 2 of you." "It's not going to waste," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "It's being cared for by people who belong here." Thomas stepped slightly forward, not threatening but unmistakably protective. "And those people aren't going anywhere." What followed was a tense negotiation that stretched through the morning hours. The Kellerman brothers had paperwork, forged documents that they claimed gave them legal right to the property. But Thomas had something more powerful: connections. During his years of droving, he'd built relationships with magistrates and law enforcement officers across 3 colonies. More importantly, he'd kept detailed records of the Kellerman brothers' previous activities in his journal. "You see, the thing about drovers is," Thomas said conversationally as he spread his notes across Margaret's kitchen table, "is that we hear everything. Every campfire story, every warning, every complaint that gets filed in every dusty town between here and Darwin. And some of us write it all down." By noon, faced with evidence that could put them in prison for years, the Kellerman brothers had withdrawn their claim and ridden away, leaving behind only dust and the memory of danger past. That evening, as the sun set over land that was truly theirs, legally, morally, and in every way that mattered, Margaret and Thomas stood together on their veranda, watching Hope graze peacefully in the paddock beside the old windmill. "We did it," Margaret said, hardly believing it herself. "We did," Thomas agreed. "But you know what the most remarkable thing is? I'm not surprised. Not really, because I've learned something these past months." "What's that?" 2 people who have survived being broken can survive anything else the world throws at them, especially when they're together. Margaret leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid warmth of his chest against her cheek, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. Around them, the outback spread in all directions, vast, challenging, sometimes cruel, but no longer empty. No longer something to merely endure. "Thomas," she said softly. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of promises made and kept. "Now we live, really live. We plant that extended garden you've been planning. We fix up that back room for visitors, because I have a feeling people are going to start finding their way here, people who need what we found in each other. We write our stories down so they don't get lost. We love each other through all the seasons to come." "And when we're old and grey, When we're old and grey, we'll sit on this same veranda and tell each other the story of how a broken drover and a lonely woman saved each other in the middle of nowhere, and we'll still be amazed by how beautiful it all turned out." Margaret tilted her face up to look at him, this man who had arrived at her door more dead than alive and had somehow brought her world back to vivid Technicolor life. "Promise me something, Thomas." "Anything." "Promise me we'll never take this for granted, this connection, this love, this life we're building. Promise me we'll remember every day how precious it is." Thomas kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips, sealing the vow with the tenderness of a man who understood exactly what they had almost lost and what they had miraculously found. "I promise," he whispered against her hair. "Every sunrise, every sunset, every ordinary day in between, I promise." Above them, the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the same stars that had looked down on Margaret during her 7 years of solitude, the same stars that had guided Thomas across the vast emptiness of the continent to her door. But tonight, those stars seemed to shine with approval, as if the universe itself was celebrating this small miracle. Two people who had learned that love doesn't always arrive with fanfare, but sometimes grows quietly in the space between one heartbeat and the next, transforming everything it touches. The outback stretched endlessly around them, red earth and ghost gums, and silence so profound it could break a person's spirit or heal it completely. But Margaret and Thomas no longer saw emptiness when they looked at the horizon. They saw home. They saw forever. They saw a love that was worth every lonely day that led to its discovery. And so ends our journey with Margaret and Thomas, two souls who discovered that sometimes our greatest blessings arrive disguised as strangers at our door. Their story reminds us that love can bloom in the most unlikely places, that healing often requires the witness of another heart, and that the courage to be truly known is often rewarded beyond our wildest dreams. If this tale of resilience and unexpected love has touched something deep within you, we invite you to become part of our storytelling family. Subscribe to join us as we continue to unearth these forgotten stories of courage and connection from Australia's remarkable past. Hit that like button if Margaret and Thomas's journey reminded you that it's never too late for a new chapter in your own story. And in the comments below, share with us. Have you ever had a moment when a stranger's arrival changed everything? Your own stories of unexpected blessings inspire us to keep searching for these hidden gems of human experience, these reminders that even in the loneliest places, hope and love can take root and flourish. Until our next journey together into the heart of the human experience, remember, sometimes the most profound transformations begin with the simple act of opening our door to possibility.